century AD, a cry from the steppes of Mongolia shook Europe. The Huns were coming. In the centuries to follow, motivated by their lust for gold and blood, they would leave the land scorched, cities and towns plundered, and countless numbers dead. But their migration was forced by something more basic: survival. In their homeland of Mongolia, droughts were ruining their grazing land, and their children were dying. Around the year 395 AD, a prince was born. He would unite the Huns and change the face of Europe forever. From this barren, windswept land, his army would spread out over all Europe, looting and pillaging all before them, taking what nature had denied them. Their leader's name would be remembered forever: Attila. Plundered, robbed, and murdered. To the people of Europe, they were the horsemen of the apocalypse. Empires trembled with the sound of their hooves. They fought as no army had ever fought before, striking without warning in small groups and disappearing before the enemy could react. Legends abounded. They rode day and night, sleeping in the saddle, and dipping their arrows in the juice of boiled embryos. They ate the flesh of children and drank the blood of women. They were said to be descendants of outcast warlocks and the unclean spirits of the wilderness. Their skin was dark, their noses flat, and their faces a shapeless mass with dark holes instead of eyes. The hollowed skulls of their slain enemies served as drinking bowls. They cut their cheeks with knives in order to put their enemies to flight. If they were wounded, they would open the bellies of their horses and place the wounded limb inside. They rode as fast as the wind and were as bloodthirsty as wolves. The most persistent legend, however, told how the Huns ate raw meat, heated by being placed under the horse's saddle. There is, however, a very simple explanation for this particular tale. Fresh meat was put on sore patches on the horses' backs in order to help the healing of any cuts or bruises they may have had. But where did these mysterious people come from? Here, at the Great Wall of China, the first wars with the Huns took place. The Chinese called them Xiongnu, from which some scholars believe the term Huns may have derived. The invaders plundered the fruitful valleys of the Yellow River, but after decades of dominance, the Huns were forced back into the steppe by the Chinese. According to Chinese legends, the Huns were half human, half demon. The forefathers of the Huns had their roots in the east of the Asian continent, in the endless regions which stretch from the Siberian forests to the fruitful valleys of what today is Korea. From East Asia to the Carpathian Mountains, a culture has remained for thousands of years, which up until today has changed little. The people live in tents, called yurts. Houses of stone and cities are unknown to them. The way of life is plain and hard. They're dependent on nature and the seasons. Every year they migrate between two fixed homelands. Meat is hung to dry in the tent rafters, another tradition dating back to the days of the Huns. Even their hunting rituals have survived. Formerly with bow and arrow, but today with a rifle, a hunter performs his step dance. The prey is a groundhog, and the peculiar dancing attracts its attention. Hypnotized by the spectacle, the animal stays too long. The wealth of the nomads has always been their animal herds. Meat and milk are vital to their existence. Dried in the open air, cheese is processed from milk. Animal hides are used as shoes, laces, saddles, harnesses, and clothing. Everything they own is designed for mobility. Living principally off domesticated animals, they must always search for fresh pastures. Deep in Mongolia, isolated nomad tribes once gathered together to form a belligerent power. Today, however, Lamaistic monks are again allowed to practice their religion freely. Unfortunately, the day-to-day lives of the Huns aren't known as they didn't keep written records. Their story was always recorded by others, usually their enemies. Chinese chronicles, such as the famous Book of History, reported their fearless bravery in battle and their brutality. At the edge of the Gobi Desert, they built their first empire. In the 4th century AD, after many rich years, a severe change in climate forced the Huns to move. The summers became short and cold, the earth continually frozen. The animals perished. So, the long migration for fresher climes began. From the eastern extremity of the Asian continent, the Huns headed west and south. The Chinese protected themselves by building the Great Wall. The Hun tribes left their native lands and moved west over thousands of miles. Some invaded Persia, others Asia Minor. The majority, however, moved through South Russia towards Europe, where the native tribes were overrun. The Burgundians were pushed across the Rhine. The Goths were driven southward and forced to split up. Some migrated to southern France and others to northern Italy. The Langobards fled south. The Saxons sought refuge in Britain, and the Franks crossed the Rhine. The Vandals moved across the longest distances through Spain and all the way to North Africa. The Huns finally gathered in the Hungarian lowland plains, creating a base from which they continually plunged Europe into chaos. Entire nations, as well as small tribes, were forced from their homes. The Huns overran tribe after tribe after tribe. An ancient scholar of the time, St. Ambrosius, described the death of his brother with relief, that now he might not fall into the hands of the barbarians, that he might not see the ruin of the whole earth, the burial of relatives, the death of fellow citizens, the end of the world. The Huns appeared as the personification of evil, as a judgment of God, as the end, wrought with pestilence, war, hunger, and death, just as had been predicted in the book of Revelations. Like crows snatching prey away from an eagle, the Huns now threatened the Roman Empire. By the beginning of the 5th century, Western Rome had had enough. It bought peace for itself from Attila's uncle, Ruar, the king of the Huns. As part of the treaty, the Huns and the Romans exchanged princes for insurance, as hostages to secure the peace. It would be during this time that the young Attila would live among the very people against whom he would later wage a bitter and bloody war. Around 410 AD, Aetius, the young Roman prince, was sent to live with the Huns, and the young Attila was sent to northern Italy. In the imperial city of Ravenna, Prince Attila was introduced to life at the court of Emperor Honorius. In the power center of the Western Roman world, Attila became acquainted with the refined manners and customs of a new civilization. For Attila, the West was a revelation. He learned of a new faith, Christianity. His hosts taught him to speak, read, and write in Latin. They taught him to understand the world through the eyes of the Romans. Life here was a far cry from his early years on the steppes of Mongolia. He experienced the final glory of the empire before it was destroyed by its own decadence and corruption. Ironically, these learning years would one day make him Rome's most dangerous enemy. Meanwhile, far away, Aetius was learning the ways of the Huns. A close friendship developed between the son of the Roman Empire and the mountain son of the steppe. Aetius would one day be a Roman commander, and Attila, king of the Huns. While there was still peace in Western Rome, the Huns conquered the north of Persia. Their next destination was Antiochia, today the city of Antakya in southern Turkey. The town was quickly overrun. "They were among us without us knowing where they came from," wrote one eyewitness. "On the steps of the temple, they took our children." Families fled the city. They built new settlements as their original homes had been destroyed. The victorious Hun king, Ruar, proudly pointed to the sun and said, "Everything it shines upon I can conquer if I want to." The terrible news of the horde's atrocities quickly spread to Rome. The civilized world seemed to have been deserted by the God of the Christians. "The world is already sinking and approaching old age," wrote Bishop Augustinus. In the eyes of Rome, he spoke a painful truth. With all of Europe at their feet, the Huns continued to plunder the known world. The secret behind their strength was an almost modern infrastructure which allowed news to be relayed to faraway dominions. Traveling from outpost to outpost, couriers rode over thousands of miles to every corner of the Hun world. During his uncle Ruar's reign, Attila himself allegedly traveled to the eastern Roman provinces, where he participated in battle expeditions. Huge distances were covered by man and horse. The Huns took along their women and children and their animals on these travels. But the expeditions were not without their casualties. Along the trails, archaeologists have found many Hun graves. Almost all of them have been looted over the centuries. Gravestones mark the sites in the Mongolian highlands. This skull was discovered in the grave fields of Western Mongolia. And archaeologists also found this bronze kettle there, a typical cult object of the Huns. 30 of these enormous kettles were found by archaeologists between Mongolia and Western Europe. This discovery, from the grave of a prince found in France, is of unique beauty. Jewelry and sword handles made of pure gold, rings, buckles and weapons studded with almadines, no doubt plundered from Hun excursions into Persia. Such finds belie the Roman legend that the Huns were merely primitive barbarians. This ring of gold was an insignia of rank. Utensils for daily use were decorated with ornaments. Gold buckles and necklaces were not just found in the graves of the rich. The shape of this skull gives another insight into Hun life. Children were provided with tight ribbons around the skull in order to force the soft bone into the shape of a tower. Such skull deformation was regarded as a form of great beauty by the Huns and was later adopted by Germanic tribes. One of the oldest Hun artifacts discovered is this rug from Mongolia, which survived in the frozen ground for almost 2,000 years. Its wild patterns of mythical animals suggest the Huns may have led a rich religious life. Like a trip into the past of the Huns, a shaman woman, here in a trance, calls the souls of the dead with her magic drum. Mysterious rituals suggest the Huns were a superstitious people who relied heavily on the reading of bones and horses' intestines to predict the future. By the turn of the 5th century, a Roman province in the Hungarian lowlands was occupied by the Huns. Pannonia became their homeland. Over many years, the Huns who had come over the steppe evolved from warriors to farmers. They gradually came to depend on the agriculture of the region they controlled. It was here that Attila grew into a young man. In the year 435, Attila's brother, Prince Bleda, negotiated with Rome. The Roman Empire was crumbling and needed Huns as soldiers because many tribes were in revolt. The Burgundians, resisting Rome's supremacy, had settled on the Rhine. Under Prince Bleda, a Hun army waged a terrible war of destruction against them. Their king, Gunther, was killed. It was also the last year of the reign of Ruar, the aging king of the Huns. After his death, he was succeeded by Attila and Bleda. Attila, however, wanted to reign alone. He drove out the lower-ranking chiefs and princes. Anyone who didn't follow him was forced to flee. He entered into pacts with his Germanic neighbors, even accepting Germanic chiefs into the ruling class. But he still had one opponent, his brother Bleda. Attila killed him in cold blood. Now he was the sole leader of the Huns. He relied on a group of faithful followers whom he rewarded with gifts of gold. But the Huns needed more gold. How else was Attila to feed a people whose trade was war? Rome was forced to pay more and more every year to keep the peace. This painting by Delacroix shows Attila at the height of his power. At Attila's court, people drank from gold-plated cups, but Attila himself only had a wooden cup. His clothes were plain and without ornaments. His sword and the reins of his horse were not decorated with gold or precious stones, unlike those of other lesser men. The Roman Empire, which encompassed half of Europe, had become an immovable colossus. Unrest was brewing in many provinces. Rome was not up to a war against the Huns. The simple Roman was not interested in war. Rather, he wanted to pursue his trade. The Roman citizens, who had been forced to pay for the wars for decades, longed for the golden time of peace. Although the Roman soldiers were well equipped with weapons, their leather breastplates were useless. Arrowheads of iron pierced them like paper. They were the miracle weapons of the Huns, from which the soldiers fled in panic. So the Romans produced heavy suits of armor, but these only made the soldiers less mobile. In the early 5th century, the Hun terror seemed to occupy the days and nights of the empire. This crypt in a northern Italian church had been buried for centuries. Here, visible in drawings on a wall, the military supremacy of the Huns becomes obvious. A Roman and a Hun are depicted here. The Roman chases the Hun with a lance. The Hun, standing in his stirrup, fires to the rear. The Museum of Anthropology in Vienna. Not far away from the city, the remains of a warrior from the Hun era were found. The last minutes of his life can be reconstructed. It appears he received a sword blow on the head during combat. The fracture was deep, but not fatal. From some distance, an archer fired at him, his arrow piercing a vertebra. The arrowhead is still in the bone today. The warrior then sank to his knees. Then another blow hits the fatally wounded soldier on the head. Attila played Eastern and Western Rome against each other. Western Rome had its peace and paid voluntarily, while Attila plundered Eastern Rome. A change in power in Constantinople, though, threatened to bring him down. Eastern Rome now threatened war, and Western Rome refused to pay any more money. Attila would not want to risk a war on two fronts. So he drew up a dramatic plan. He demanded the hand of the Roman Emperor's sister, Honoria, and Gaul as dowry. But the emperor refused, thus setting the stage for Attila's invasion. Attila was already at war in Persia, but at the beginning of 451 AD, he led his troops across the Rhine to Gaul. It was one of the Western Empire's wealthiest regions, a land of fertile soil and rich grazing pastures. When the campaign started in Gaul, Attila had to rely on the Germanic allies more than ever. He made sure no one would dare rise up against him. The terror would come across the Rhine and burn its way into the memory of the Western world. The French towns trembled with fear at the Huns' attacks. The city of Metz was burned to the ground. Orléans was besieged for weeks. Churches and monasteries were plundered and set on fire. When the Bishop of Reims marched towards the Huns to beg for mercy for the town, he was beheaded while he sang holy psalms. The peaceful cities of the Gauls were razed to the ground in one deadly move. Legend has it that Attila spared the city of Paris because he believed an attack on the town would bring bad luck. He would need more good fortune on his side in the coming days. Attila moved to eastern Gaul, towards the open country of Champagne. Behind this overgrown wall of an old Celtic castle, the Huns set up camp. They would not rest for long. Aetius, the Roman commander and Attila's childhood friend, sent his largest contingent of troops against the Huns and their allies. Almost 50,000 soldiers on Attila's side prepared for the war. Attila girded himself for battle. He and his warriors had yet to be beaten by the Roman Empire. On the Catalonian plains, the Huns engaged in the most desperate battle in their history. With vigor, they employed the techniques that had already brought them victory across Europe: speed, horsemanship, and mastery of the bow and arrow. But this time, they had met their match. The massacre lasted into the evening. Thousands died from both sides. The combined forces of the Romans and the Goths brought the Huns to a stalemate. In the darkness, the Huns retreated. For the first time in his life, Attila prepared himself for death and had a funeral pyre built. He would rather be burned than end up in the hands of his enemies. But it wouldn't come to that. An oracle was questioned about the outcome of the battle. Attila's soldiers awaited news of their fate. Would they live, or would they die? The soothsayer took the shoulder blade of a sheep from the embers of the fire. In it, he read a foreboding message. The Huns would be defeated and a great enemy leader would die. Attila ordered the retreat. Remembering their childhood bond, Aetius allowed Attila to escape unchallenged. The idyllic scenes of today's Basi-le-Château are in contrast to the time of Attila's great battle. The Gaul left behind was smoking like a solitary funeral pyre. Thousands lost their lives. Hills now rise from the flat landscape. Legend has it they're hills made from the bones of soldiers who died in the battle on the Catalonian plains. As for the great enemy leader predicted to die, it was Theodoric, king of the West Goths. Legend has it that he's buried here. It is said that on the anniversary of the battle, one can hear the sound of fighting and the cries of the dying. And then the Roman commander, Aetius, here on the left, and Attila on the right, fight once again. The village of Cortisol in Champagne still bears the legacy of the marauding Huns. The village name is said to be derived from the Hun language. In the town of Troy, children born here display similar marks on their bodies to those found on children in Mongolia, the original home of the Huns. The town's doctor explains.
Approximately 2,500 children are born every year in the maternity ward of Troyes who show this distinctive mark. It is a bluish discoloration above the coccyx in children who are otherwise completely white. If a mother notices this, she mentions the problem. There are several terms for it. It's simply known as the Mongolian spot.
The Mongolian spot, which is otherwise only found in Asian or Oriental people, is a harmless change in the pigmentation of the skin. This characteristic is perfectly normal in Mongolia. The fact that children with this spot are born in Champagne is a possible indication of the settlement of Hun soldiers. Other Hun characteristics and traditions can be found elsewhere in Europe. In one of the valleys of Switzerland, where soldiers from the Hun era allegedly settled, the last rites at a funeral are given, not inside a church, but outside. Then, all funeral guests have to leave this yard. Only the closest male relatives are allowed to place the deceased in the grave. Historians see parallels to old traditions from the time of the migration of nations. In order to prevent looting, the graves of the deceased were kept secret except to the very closest family. Foreign-sounding names are found on the tomb inscriptions. They too supposedly go back to the language of the Huns. The traditions after the funeral service are also unique. A certain type of cheese is prepared while the deceased is still alive and dried for the day of the funeral. Is it possible that the remainders of the Hun nomad tradition have survived for more than 1,500 years? This is the Val d'Annivière in the Swiss Alps, an isolated high valley only accessible from one side. For centuries, the rough terrain sheltered a vestige of Hun civilization. Here, at almost 5,000 feet above sea level, there is a sinister stone formation. The Stone of Savages. Legend has it that this was where the Huns held court. Those convicts found guilty of a crime were forced to throw themselves to their deaths. As in France, scattered, leaderless Huns also stayed behind in northern Italy. But they were constantly threatened by the local population, so they fled across the passes of the Alps into the valleys of what today is Switzerland. After their defeat on the Catalonian plains, Attila's men fought their way across the Alps to the east. The Hungarian lowlands had to be reached before the harsh winter began. The agonizing march would be the first of many. wounds from the last battle had hardly healed when Attila gave the order to break camp and move on into the next battle. Once again, Attila demanded the hand of the Roman Emperor's sister, and in 452 AD, he took his demand straight to Rome. Despite their travels across the Alps, his men were still eager. War had long been their industry. Defeat hadn't damaged their spirits or determination, nor had it affected Attila's reputation. The Roman bastions in the Alps were overrun. The first city to fall was Aquileia in northern Italy. For 3 desperate months, Attila laid siege to the city. The calm serenity in the town today is in stark contrast to the plight of the citizens confronted by the great Attila and his horde of barbarians. The Forum was devastated. Then Attila struck a crippling blow. The key to the city's wealth, its harbor, was destroyed. So the 200,000 inhabitants of Aquileia fled from the attacking Huns into the swamps. Here they would be safe, because the Huns' horses would sink into the soft ground of the swamp. The refugees slowly established a new city called Veni Etiam, meaning, I made it this far. In time, the name Veni Etiam would become known as Venice. Undaunted by the escape of the Aquileians, Attila led his men deeper into Italy. The quieter life of today's towns and cities along the way betray a moment in history when it seemed the horsemen of the apocalypse had arrived. People fled in panic. Unlike the inhabitants of Aquileia, they had few places to hide. Amongst the grandeur of the region today, a small but bitter note can be found of Attila's place in their history. A fresco on the facade of the monastery in Pavia is a reminder of the journeys of the Huns and their king, Attila. The inscription reads, Attila flagellum Dei, Attila, the Lord's scourge. Near where a fishing village now lies along the River Po, Attila and his men had to deal with a new enemy. An epidemic of malaria had broken out. But again, luck would be on his side. Out of the blue, the Romans sued for peace. Attila agreed to the negotiations, not letting it be known that if Rome chose to, his men would have been in no fit state to fight. In the small town of Borghetto in Upper Italy, the historic encounter took place. Rome sent Pope Leo to conduct the negotiations. The eventual agreement spared a beleaguered Rome from the wrath of Attila and gave the papacy new powers. For his work, Pope Leo later received the title Leo the Great. The Huns' departure was due not so much to Roman intimidation, but to the treasures they were offered. Loaded down with their booty, Attila and his men headed for their Hungarian homelands. Esztergom Gran on the Danube in Hungary. Where today a cathedral stands, Etzel's castle supposedly once stood, Etzel being the name given to Attila in German legend. According to this legend, Attila asked for the hand in marriage of the daughter of a Germanic prince. But the daughter had a plan in which the Hun king would pay for the murder of her fellow countrymen. Their wedding took place in Hungary. It was not only to be a celebration of the union between Attila and the German princess, but also it was perceived as being a victory over Rome. The banquet afterwards was an almost endless affair of food, wine, and song. Attila died during the wedding night of a hemorrhage. His young bride was suspected, as she had promised to avenge the deaths of her countrymen. With his sudden death, the now leaderless empire broke up. It had been an empire that had ravaged Europe for almost 2 centuries. In mourning, his men cut off their hair. They disfigured their faces with deep wounds, so that the glorious hero would be mourned not with the tears of women, but the blood of men. His dead body was laid in state, and his saddle, weapons, and clothing were burned. Horsemen from the entire Hun population circled around on the open plain, and a dirge was sung for one of history's most savage warriors. During the night, however, the dead body was secretly put into the earth. A large number of the Huns, who were scattered over half of Europe, retreated back to the east, back to the Mongolian steppes from where they originally came. Attila's reign lasted 8 years. 8 years which changed the world.